The rain was coming down harder than it had in weeks, turning the alley behind Murphy's diner into a river of broken dreams and forgotten promises. I pulled my worn army jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in my left knee where the shrapnel still lived, a permanent reminder of a war that ended for everyone else, but never really ended for me. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint, so desperate, that at first I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on my mind. But there it was again, a whimpering, barely audible above the drumming of rain against the dumpster lids. My heart stopped for a moment, because I knew that sound. I'd heard it before, in places where hope goes to die. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? My name is Marcus, and 3 months ago, I was living under the overpass on Elm Street with nothing but a sleeping bag, a backpack full of everything I owned, and memories that wouldn't let me sleep. The VA had tried their best, but some wounds run deeper than medicine can reach. Some battles you fight alone, in the dark corners of your mind, where the echoes of gunfire never really fade away. I'd been homeless for 8 months when this story began. 8 months of learning that dignity isn't something you lose all at once. It disappears piece by piece, like leaves falling from a tree in autumn. First, it was my apartment when the medical bills piled up higher than my disability checks could cover. Then it was my car when I couldn't make the payments. Finally, it was my pride when I realized that the uniform I'd worn with honor in Afghanistan couldn't protect me from the enemy that was poverty back home. The streets teach you things they don't cover in basic training. They teach you that a dry spot under a bridge is worth more than gold. They teach you that kindness from strangers is rarer than water in the desert. And they teach you that sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, life has one more lesson waiting for you. That rainy Tuesday evening in October, I was making my usual rounds through the downtown area, checking the spots where business owners sometimes left day-old bread, or where restaurants threw out food that was still good enough to keep a man alive. It wasn't much of a life, but it was the life I'd been dealt, and I was determined to play the hand with whatever dignity I had left. The alley behind Murphy's diner had always been good to me. Old Murphy himself, a Korean War vet who understood the look in my eyes without me having to explain it, would sometimes leave a container of soup or half a sandwich on the loading dock. He never made a big show of it, never made me feel like charity. He'd just nod when he saw me, veteran to veteran, and somehow that container would appear later when the dinner rush died down. But that night was different. That night, the rain was washing the city clean, and I was soaked to the bone despite my jacket. My boots squelched through puddles that reflected the neon signs from the street, turning the water into pools of red and blue light. I was thinking about finding shelter, maybe heading back to the underpass early, when I heard it again. The whimpering. It was coming from behind the dumpster, weak and desperate, almost swallowed by the sound of the storm. I stood perfectly still, listening. Because on the streets you learn to pay attention to sounds that don't belong. Sometimes those sounds mean danger. Sometimes they mean opportunity. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they mean something else entirely. I moved toward the sound, my boots splashing through the flooded alley. And that's when I saw it. A cardboard box, soggy and falling apart, tucked between the dumpster and the brick wall of the building. The box was disintegrating in the rain, and whatever was inside was in trouble. My heart started pounding in a way it hadn't since Afghanistan. There's something about helplessness that cuts through all the walls you build around yourself. Something about innocence in danger that makes you forget your own problems, your own pain, your own fears. I knelt down in the dirty water, not caring that it soaked through my jeans, and carefully lifted one of the soggy cardboard flaps. What I saw inside broke something inside my chest, and put it back together again all at the same time. 3 puppies, tiny, shivering, barely old enough to open their eyes. They were huddled together in what was left of an old towel, their small bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from hunger and fear. Their fur was matted and wet, their little pink noses pressed against each other as they tried to share what little warmth they had left. The smallest one, a little brown and white puppy no bigger than my fist, looked up at me with eyes that held more trust than I'd seen in human faces in months. Those eyes said everything that words couldn't. They said please, they said help us, they said we're scared and we don't understand why we're here. I felt something crack open inside my chest. Something I'd kept locked away since the day I came home from overseas and realized that the world I'd fought to protect didn't seem to have a place for me in it. These puppies didn't know I was homeless. They didn't know I was broken. They didn't know I barely had enough to keep myself alive. All they knew was that I was there, and they needed help, and somehow that was enough. I reached into the box with hands that shook from more than just the cold. The puppies were so small, so fragile, that I was afraid I might hurt them just by touching them. The little brown and white one immediately tried to crawl toward my hand, its tiny paws slipping on the wet cardboard. The other two, both black with white patches on their chests, whimpered softly as I gently scooped them up. They fit in my hands like they were meant to be there. Their small bodies were warm despite the cold rain, and I could feel their tiny hearts beating against my palms like the flutter of butterfly wings. In that moment, holding those three helpless creatures, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt needed. The rain continued to pour down around us, but I barely noticed it anymore. All my attention was focused on these three small lives that had somehow found their way into mine. I tucked them inside my jacket, feeling them nestle against my chest, their tiny bodies relaxing as they found warmth and safety against my heartbeat. But even as I held them close, the reality of the situation began to sink in. I was homeless. I had no money, no resources, barely enough food to keep myself alive. What could I possibly do for three puppies who needed everything? Food, shelter, medical care, love? The smart thing would have been to take them to the animal shelter. The responsible thing would have been to admit that I couldn't help them and find someone who could. But as I stood there in that rain-soaked alley, feeling their small bodies trust me completely, I knew I couldn't walk away. These puppies had been abandoned, thrown away like garbage, left to die in a cardboard box behind a dumpster. I knew exactly how that felt. I knew what it was like to feel invisible, forgotten, unwanted. I knew what it was like to be hungry and cold and scared, wondering if tomorrow would ever come. And maybe, just maybe, that meant I was exactly the right person to save them. I started walking, not toward the animal shelter, but back toward the underpass where I'd been living. With each step, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a familiar uniform. It was terrifying and overwhelming and absolutely, completely right. The puppies had stopped whimpering. They'd settled against my chest, trusting me to keep them safe, trusting me to know what to do next. I wished I felt as confident as they seemed to think I was. The walk back to the underpass felt longer than usual, partly because I was walking more carefully with my precious cargo, and partly because my mind was racing with questions I didn't have answers to. What was I going to feed them? Where were they going to sleep? How was I going to keep them warm and dry when I could barely manage those things for myself? But underneath all those practical concerns was something deeper, something that surprised me with its intensity. For the first time in months, I had a purpose beyond just surviving another day. I had something to fight for besides myself. When I reached the underpass, I immediately began arranging my small camp differently. My sleeping bag, my few possessions, everything needed to be reorganized around the needs of three tiny puppies. I created a small nest in the corner where the concrete walls offered the most protection from wind and rain, using my spare shirt to line the bottom and my only blanket to create walls. The puppies seemed to sense that they were somewhere safe now. As I gently placed them in their makeshift bed, they immediately curled up together, their small bodies forming a perfect circle of warmth and comfort. The sight of them sleeping peacefully, trusting me to watch over them, brought tears to my eyes that I hadn't allowed myself to shed in months. That first night, I barely slept. Every small sound they made had me checking on them, making sure they were breathing, making sure they were warm enough. I gave them small sips of water from my bottle, though I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. They were so young, so fragile, and I had no idea what I was doing. But they were alive. Against all odds, in a cardboard box behind a dumpster in a rainstorm, they had survived long enough for me to find them. That had to mean something. That had to count for something. As the sun began to rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to those 3 sleeping puppies. I promised them that I would figure this out. I promised them that they would never be abandoned again. I promised them that somehow, some way, we would all be okay. I had no idea how I was going to keep that promise, but I was going to try. Part 2. The morning brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. The puppies woke up hungry, and their tiny whimpers filled the space under the overpass with a sound that cut straight through my heart. I had managed to keep them warm and dry through the night, but now they needed food, and I had no idea what to feed them. I watched them trying to nurse from each other, their small mouths searching for something that wasn't there, and I felt a panic I hadn't experienced since my first firefight in Afghanistan. This was different than any enemy I'd ever faced. These weren't insurgents with weapons. These were innocent lives depending on me, and I was failing them already. I left them sleeping in their makeshift nest and walked to the nearest convenience store. The owner, Mr. Kim, had always been polite to me, never making me feel unwelcome even though I clearly didn't fit in with his regular customers. His English was limited, but his kindness was universal. When I explained my situation, pointing at my jacket where small wet spots showed where the puppies had been nursing, his entire face changed. He disappeared into the back of the store and returned with a small container of milk and a package of hot dogs. "This is for babies," he said in his careful English, holding up the milk. Dogs like this too. His wife, Mrs. Kim, appeared from behind the counter with a small bowl and what looked like medicine droppers from a first aid kit. "You feed like this," she demonstrated, showing me how to use the dropper to give the puppies small amounts of milk. Very small, very careful. They watched me practice the motion, both of them nodding encouragingly, and I realized that these 2 people were the first to treat me like a human being in months. I tried to pay them, but Mr. Kim waved my crumpled dollar bills away. "You take care of babies," he said simply. "That is payment enough." Walking back to the underpass, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was called. Hope. Not just hope for the puppies, but hope that maybe the world still had room for kindness, even for someone like me. The feeding process was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. The puppies were so small that each drop of milk seemed enormous compared to their tiny mouths. The smallest one, who I'd started thinking of as Hope, took to the dropper immediately, her little tongue working eagerly to get every drop. The 2 black puppies, who I'd named Courage and Faith, were more hesitant at first, but hunger won out over fear. Watching them feed, seeing their tiny bellies grow round with nourishment, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since coming home from the war. This was purpose. This was mission. This was why I'd been put in that alley on that rainy night. But even as I celebrated this small victory, I knew it was just the beginning. Puppies this young needed to eat every few hours. They needed warmth, they needed medical care, and they needed things I couldn't provide living under a bridge. That afternoon, as I sat watching them sleep, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to ask for help. The downtown community center was a place I'd avoided since becoming homeless. It represented everything I'd lost: social connections, stability, belonging. But it also represented resources. And these puppies needed resources more than I needed my pride. Sarah Martinez, the center's director, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. When I walked in, still smelling like the streets, still wearing clothes that hadn't been properly washed in weeks, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She looked directly at me like I was worth looking at. I told her about the puppies, about finding them in the rain, about my promise to keep them safe. I expected lectures about responsibility, about how I couldn't care for animals when I couldn't care for myself. Instead, she picked up her phone. "Dr. Martinez, please," she said into the receiver. "I have someone here who needs your help. It's about 3 puppies, and it's urgent." Dr. Elena Martinez, no relation to Sarah, just one of those beautiful coincidences, was a veterinarian who volunteered at the community center one afternoon a week, providing free care for pets belonging to people who couldn't afford regular vet bills. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with hands that moved gently and confidently as she examined each puppy. "They're malnourished and dehydrated," she said, her voice careful and professional, "but they're strong. Whoever found them and started caring for them probably saved their lives." She looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You did good work here." Those words hit me harder than any medal or commendation I'd received in the Army. "You did good work." When was the last time someone had said that to me? When was the last time I'd felt like my actions mattered in a positive way? Dr. Martinez gave me proper puppy formula, showed me how to feed them correctly, and provided medicine for the mild infections they developed from being exposed to the elements. She also gave me her phone number. "Call me if anything changes," she said, "and bring them back in a week. We need to monitor their progress closely." The community center became my second home over the next few days. Sarah arranged for me to use their shower facilities, gave me access to their laundry, and most importantly, provided a warm, safe place for the puppies during the day while I searched for work or handled the business of survival. It was there that I met Tom Bradley, a man about my age who'd been coming to the center for 3 years. Tom had his own story of military service, job loss, and homelessness, but he'd managed to get back on his feet with the center's help. He now worked part-time at a local warehouse and rented a small studio apartment across town. "Man," he said, watching me feed the puppies with the dropper, "I never seen anything like this. You got yourself a full-time job there." He wasn't wrong. The puppies needed attention every 2 to 3 hours, around the clock. They needed to be kept warm, clean, and fed. They needed socialization and gentle handling to develop properly. They needed everything that any baby needs, multiplied by 3. But as the days passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The puppies weren't the only ones who were growing stronger. Taking care of them gave me a routine, a purpose, a reason to get up every morning that went beyond just surviving another day. I found myself standing straighter, speaking more clearly, making eye contact with people again. I was still homeless, still struggling, but I was no longer hopeless. The puppies developed personalities as they grew. Hope, the smallest, was also the bravest, always the first to explore new sounds or smells. Courage, the largest of the 3, was actually the most cautious, preferring to watch his sisters investigate before joining in. And Faith, the middle child, was the peacekeeper, always curling up between the other 2 when they played too roughly. Watching them interact, seeing their individual personalities emerge, I realized something profound. These weren't just animals I was caring for. They were individuals, each with their own spirit, their own way of seeing the world. They had thoughts and feelings and preferences and fears, just like people. And they loved me. Not because I had money or a house or status. Not because I was successful or whole, or had my life figured out. They loved me because I was there, because I fed them and kept them warm, and spoke to them gently in the quiet hours of the night. That kind of unconditional love changes you. It heals parts of your soul you didn't even know were broken. 3 weeks after I found them, the puppies were strong enough to walk around on their own. Though they never strayed far from me. They would tumble over each other playing, then return to huddle against my legs or chest, seeking the comfort and security they'd learned to associate with my presence. I was their pack leader, their protector, their whole world. And they had become mine. It was around this time that the local newspaper got wind of the story. Someone at the community center had mentioned it to a reporter. And suddenly there was interest in doing a piece about the homeless veteran caring for 3 rescued puppies. I was hesitant at first. The last thing I wanted was pity or to become some kind of spectacle. But Sarah convinced me that the story might help other people, might show them that homeless individuals were still human beings capable of love and sacrifice. The reporter, Jessica Walsh, was respectful and kind. She spent an afternoon with me and the puppies, watching me feed them, listening to my story, taking pictures of us together. The article, when it came out, was titled "Homeless Veteran Finds Purpose in Caring for Rescued Puppies." I didn't expect much to come from it. Maybe a few people would read it and feel good about themselves for caring. Maybe it would raise a little awareness about veteran homelessness. I certainly didn't expect what actually happened. The response was overwhelming. The newspaper received hundreds of calls from people wanting to help. Donations poured in: money, puppy supplies, offers of temporary housing, job opportunities. The community center had to set up a special fund just to manage all the contributions. More importantly, people started showing up, not just to see the puppies, though they were undeniably adorable, but to meet me, to hear my story, to offer their support and friendship. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, I felt connected to my community again. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow whose husband had served in Vietnam, brought homemade meals every few days. She would sit with me and the puppies, sharing stories about her late husband's struggles with readjustment after the war. She understood things that others couldn't, and her presence was like a gentle balm on wounds I'd carried for too long. A local construction company offered me part-time work, with flexible hours that would allow me to continue caring for the puppies. The owner, Mike Sullivan, was a Navy veteran who understood that some battles continue long after the war is over. "You do good work, Marcus," he said, echoing Dr. Martinez's words from weeks earlier. "On the job site, and with those pups, we could use someone like you on our team." The work was physical, demanding, but it felt good to be productive again, to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond just caring for 3 small animals. Though caring for 3 small animals had turned out to be pretty meaningful too. As the puppies grew from helpless infants into playful juveniles, I began to face a question I'd been avoiding. What would happen to them as they got bigger? My living situation under the overpass was temporary at best, and 3 growing dogs would need more space, more resources, more stability than I could provide. Several people had offered to adopt them. Good people with nice homes and yards and the ability to provide everything the puppies would need. The logical choice was clear, but logic and love don't always align, and the thought of giving them up felt like having my heart torn out of my chest. It was Dr. Martinez who helped me see the situation clearly. During one of our weekly checkups, she sat down with me after examining the puppies. "Marcus," she said, "these dogs adore you. Anyone can see that. But they're going to need things you can't give them right now. Space to run, consistent medical care, proper nutrition as they grow. That doesn't mean you love them any less. It means you love them enough to want what's best for them." Her words were wise, but they didn't make the decision any easier. How do you give up the beings that gave you back your purpose, your hope, your sense of worth? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, my friend from the community center, had been following my story closely. He'd watched me transform from a broken man living under a bridge to someone who'd found meaning and connection through caring for 3 small lives. And he had an idea. What if you didn't have to choose? He asked one afternoon, as we watched the puppies play in the small yard behind the community center. What if there was a way to keep them and give them what they need? He'd been thinking about this for weeks, he explained. His studio apartment was small, but his landlord also owned a small house across town that had been sitting empty for months. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, had read the newspaper article and been moved by the story. He was willing to rent the house at a greatly reduced rate to someone he felt was deserving of a second chance. The house had a yard. It had space for 3 growing dogs and 1 healing veteran. It had potential for becoming a real home. The catch was that I'd need to demonstrate I could maintain stable employment and care for the property responsibly. The construction job was a good start, but I'd need to prove I could sustain it long-term. For the first time in over a year, I had concrete goals that extended beyond just making it through another day. I needed to keep my job, save money for the deposit and first month's rent, and prove that I was ready to be a responsible tenant and dog owner. The puppies, now 12 weeks old and full of energy and mischief, seemed to sense that something important was happening. They followed me everywhere with even more dedication than usual, as if they were afraid I might disappear. Their faith in me was both inspiring and terrifying. Hope had grown into a confident, curious dog who approached every new experience with enthusiasm. Courage had become the protector of the group, always positioning himself between his sisters and anything he perceived as a potential threat. Faith remained the peacekeeper, using gentle nudges and soft whimpers to settle disputes and comfort anyone who seemed distressed. They were becoming the dogs they were meant to be, and I was becoming the man I'd forgotten I could be. The day finally came when I had enough money saved for the deposit and first month's rent. Mr. Peterson met me at the house, a small, 2-bedroom place with a fenced yard and enough space for all of us to live comfortably. He walked through the rooms with me, pointing out features and explaining expectations, but I could tell he was more interested in my story than my credit score. You know, he said as we stood in the backyard watching the puppies explore their potential new territory. I served in Korea back in the 50s, came home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with us veterans. I understand what it's like to feel forgotten. He handed me the keys that afternoon. Just like that, for the first time in almost a year, I had a home again. We had a home. Moving day was both chaotic and magical. The community center had organized volunteers to help, and people I'd never met showed up with trucks and strong backs and warm smiles. Mrs. Henderson brought cleaning supplies and spent the afternoon making sure every surface sparkled. Mike Sullivan and his crew donated their time to fix a few minor repairs and make sure everything was safe and functional. The puppies were beside themselves with excitement, running from room to room, investigating every corner, claiming every space as their own. They seemed to understand that this was something special, something permanent. That first night in our new home, I sat on the floor of the living room with hope, courage, and faith curled up around me, and I cried. Not tears of sadness or despair, but tears of gratitude and amazement at how much life could change in just a few months. For months earlier, I'd been a broken man living under a bridge, convinced that my best days were behind me, that I had nothing left to offer the world. Now I was sitting in my own home, surrounded by 3 healthy, happy dogs who loved me unconditionally, part of a community that had embraced and supported me. The puppies had saved me just as much as I'd saved them. Maybe more. Part 3. Life in our new home settled into a rhythm that felt almost magical after months of uncertainty. Every morning, I'd wake up to 3 eager faces and wagging tails, ready to start another day of adventures. The puppies had grown into beautiful young dogs, each weighing about 30 pounds and full of energy and personality. Hope had developed into a natural leader, always the first to investigate new situations and quick to comfort anyone who seemed upset. Her brown and white coat had grown thick and lustrous, and her eyes held an intelligence that sometimes took my breath away. She seemed to understand not just my words but my emotions, appearing at my side whenever I felt overwhelmed or sad. Courage, despite his name, remained the most cautious of the 3. His black coat gleamed in the sunlight, and the white patch on his chest had grown into a perfect heart shape. He was the guardian of our little pack, always alert to potential threats, always positioning himself between his sisters and anything unfamiliar. But with people he trusted, he was gentle as a lamb. Faith, with her glossy black coat and white paws that looked like she was wearing socks, had become the social butterfly of the group. She was the first to greet visitors, the quickest to make friends with other dogs at the park, the one who could charm anyone with her playful antics and soulful eyes. Watching them grow and develop their unique personalities was like witnessing a miracle in slow motion. They had gone from 3 helpless, abandoned creatures to confident, loving companions who brought joy to everyone they met. My work at the construction company had become more than just a job. Mike Sullivan had promoted me to supervisor after 6 months, recognizing skills I'd forgotten I possessed. Leading a team, solving problems, building something lasting, it all felt familiar in the best possible way. The military had trained me for leadership, and civilian life was finally giving me a chance to use those skills constructively. The extra income from the promotion allowed me to provide better care for Hope, Courage, and Faith. Regular vet visits, high-quality food, toys, and all the little luxuries that make life better for both dogs and humans. But more than that, it gave me the security to plan for the future, something I hadn't been able to do in years. Dr. Martinez had become not just our veterinarian, but a close friend. She marveled at how healthy and well-adjusted the dogs had become, often using them as examples of how love and consistent care could overcome even the most difficult beginnings. "You know," she said during one of our visits, "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 8 years, and I've never seen a stronger bond between animals and their human. These dogs would do anything for you, and it shows in everything about them. Their confidence, their health, their happiness." Her words meant more to me than she could know. For so long, I'd felt like I was failing at everything, like I couldn't take care of myself, let alone anyone else. But here was proof that I could not only care for other living beings, but help them thrive. The local newspaper had continued to follow our story, checking in every few months to see how we were doing. The follow-up articles brought continued support from the community, but more importantly, they had inspired other people to take action. 3 other homeless veterans in our area had been connected with resources and support after reading about my experience. 2 of them had found stable housing, and 1 had been reunited with his estranged family. The community center had expanded their programs for homeless veterans, using our story as an example of what was possible with the right support and opportunities. But perhaps the most unexpected development was the number of people who reached out saying that our story had inspired them to volunteer, to donate, to get involved in helping others. A ripple effect of kindness had spread far beyond what any of us had imagined possible. One afternoon in late spring, almost a year after I'd found the puppies in that cardboard box, Sarah Martinez from the community center called with an unusual request. "Marcus," she said, her voice excited, "I've got something I want to run by you. There's a national conference on veteran homelessness happening next month, and they've asked if you'd be willing to speak about your experience." The idea terrified me. Standing in front of hundreds of people, telling my story, being vulnerable in such a public way. It went against every instinct I developed over the past few years. But Sarah pressed on. "Your story isn't just about you anymore," she said gently. "It's about hope. It's about what's possible when communities come together to support each other. People need to hear that homelessness isn't the end of someone's story. It can be the beginning of something beautiful." I looked down at Hope, Courage, and Faith, who were lying at my feet as always, their presence a constant reminder of how much my life had changed. If sharing my story could help even one person, wasn't that worth the discomfort? 2 weeks later, I found myself standing on a stage in front of 300 social workers, policymakers, and advocates, with 3 well-behaved dogs sitting calmly beside me. My hands shook as I began to speak, but as I told the story of that rainy night in the alley, of the cardboard box and the 3 helpless puppies, my voice grew stronger. I talked about the shame of homelessness, the way it strips away your sense of worth and belonging. I talked about the kindness of strangers like Mr. and Mrs. Kim, Sarah Martinez, Dr. Martinez, and so many others who had seen past my circumstances to the person underneath. And I talked about how caring for 3 small lives had given me back my own. But most importantly, I talked about community, about how none of us make it alone, how we all need each other, how helping others is often the path to healing ourselves. When I finished speaking, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But more meaningful than the applause were the conversations afterward. Social workers sharing new ideas for programs, advocates talking about policy changes, individuals committing to volunteer in their own communities. The conference organizers asked if I'd be willing to speak at other events, to continue sharing my story and advocating for better support for homeless veterans. It was the beginning of something I'd never expected, a new career as an advocate and speaker. Over the following months, I spoke at conferences, community meetings, and fundraising events across the state. Hope, Courage, and Faith came with me to many of these events, serving as living proof of the transformative power of love and care. They were natural ambassadors, charming audiences and demonstrating the joy that comes from second chances. But it wasn't just professional speaking opportunities that came from our story. We began receiving invitations to visit schools, where I talked to children about kindness to animals and caring for those in need. The dogs were perfect for these visits, gentle and patient with even the smallest children, seeming to understand their important role as educators. One visit particularly stands out in my memory. We were at Roosevelt Elementary School, talking to a 3rd grade class about compassion and responsibility. A little girl named Emma, who had been quiet throughout my presentation, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my daddy says homeless people are just lazy. But you're not lazy. You saved the puppies, and now you help other people." Why does my daddy say that? The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was mean-spirited, Emma was genuinely confused, but because it revealed the kind of misconceptions that made homelessness even more difficult to overcome. I knelt down to her level, with Faith moving to sit beside me, as if she sensed the importance of the moment. "Emma," I said gently, "sometimes people say things about situations they don't understand. Being homeless doesn't mean someone is lazy or bad. Sometimes people face problems that are bigger than they can handle alone, like losing a job or getting sick or coming back from war with invisible injuries. What matters is how we treat each other when someone needs help." The little girl nodded solemnly, then reached out to pet Faith's soft ears. Faith leaned into the touch, her tail wagging slowly, and I saw Emma's face light up with a smile. After the presentation, Emma's teacher pulled me aside. She told me that Emma's father had recently lost his job, and the family was struggling financially. The little girl had been worried they might become homeless too, and my story had helped her understand that needing help didn't make someone a bad person. These moments, connecting with individuals, changing perspectives one conversation at a time, became the most rewarding part of my new role as an advocate. But they also reminded me daily of how much work remained to be done. The speaking engagements were fulfilling, but they also revealed to me the scope of the problems facing homeless veterans across the country. In every city I visited, I met people whose stories echoed my own. Veterans who had served their country with honor, only to return home to face challenges that society seemed ill-equipped to address. This realization led to the next phase of my journey with hope, courage, and faith. Working with Sarah Martinez and the Community Center, we developed a program called Pause for Purpose, an initiative that paired homeless veterans with rescue animals, providing support for both the humans and the pets while they worked towards stable housing and employment. The program was based on the simple recognition that caring for another living being can provide purpose, routine, and emotional healing that traditional services sometimes miss. It wasn't meant to replace existing programs, but to complement them with the unique healing power of the human-animal bond. Hope, courage, and faith became the program's unofficial mascots and training ambassadors, helping to evaluate potential animal partners and demonstrating proper care techniques. Watching them work with other veterans and rescue animals was like seeing the circle of compassion expand before my eyes. The first veteran to join the program was a woman named Lisa, who had served 3 tours in Iraq and had been living in her car for 6 months after losing her apartment. She was paired with Max, a senior German shepherd who had been surrendered to the shelter when his elderly owner passed away. The transformation in both Lisa and Max was remarkable to witness. Max, who had been depressed and listless at the shelter, perked up immediately with Lisa's consistent care and attention. Lisa, who had been isolated and struggling with severe depression, found new purpose in ensuring Max received the medical care he needed for his arthritis and the love he deserved in his golden years. Within 4 months, Lisa had found stable housing and part-time employment at a pet supply store, where her knowledge of animal care made her invaluable to customers. Max had regained his playful spirit and was serving as an unofficial therapy dog for other veterans in the program. Story after story like Lisa and Max's reinforced what I'd learned that night in the alley behind Murphy's Diner. Sometimes the act of saving someone else is what saves you. As our 2nd year in the house approached, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought us to this point. Hope, courage, and faith were now full-grown dogs, healthy and happy, and an integral part of a community that had embraced us all completely. Hope had grown into a beautiful 45-pound mixed breed with the confident personality of a natural leader. She accompanied me to most speaking engagements and had developed an uncanny ability to sense when someone in the audience was struggling emotionally. She would often approach these individuals after my presentations, offering the kind of wordless comfort that only animals can provide. Courage, now 50 pounds of solid muscle and loyalty, had become the protector I'd always known he would be. His cautious nature made him an excellent judge of character, and I'd learned to trust his instincts about people. But with children, elderly people, and anyone who was hurting, he was as gentle as a lamb. Faith, the smallest at 40 pounds but the biggest in personality, had become our social ambassador. She could charm anyone within minutes, and her playful nature made her perfect for school visits and community events. She had a particular gift for connecting with children who were shy or scared, seeming to understand exactly how to approach them without being overwhelming. Together, the 4 of us had become something I'd never expected, a family. Not just in the biological sense, but in the truest meaning of the word. We were bonded by love, by shared experiences, by the commitment to care for each other no matter what challenges we faced. The house had become more than just a place to live. It had become a home in every sense, filled with laughter, love, and the constant presence of 3 dogs who had taught me that joy could be found in the simplest moments. The sound of their paws on the hardwood floors, the sight of them playing in the backyard, the warmth of their bodies curled up next to me on the couch while watching television. These small, everyday moments had become precious beyond measure. But perhaps the most profound change was in how I saw myself. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I felt like I had something valuable to offer the world. My experiences, both the dark ones and the triumphant ones, had become tools for helping others navigate their own difficult journeys. The speaking engagements had evolved into something more significant. I was now working with policymakers to develop better support systems for homeless veterans, consulting with shelters on best practices for animal care programs, and training other advocates on effective storytelling techniques. Hope, courage, and faith had become integral to this work, not just as symbols of what was possible, but as active participants in healing and hope. They had their own following on social media, where their daily adventures and the stories of the veterans they helped were shared with thousands of people around the world. One evening, as I sat in our backyard watching the three of them play in the golden light of sunset, I thought about that night in the alley when I'd first heard their desperate whimpering. At the time, I'd thought I was saving them. Now I understood the truth. We had saved each other. The rain had washed more than just the city clean that night. It had washed away my old life, my old limitations, my old beliefs about what was possible. In that cardboard box, falling apart in the storm, I had found not just 3 helpless puppies, but a new version of myself. A version that was capable of love, of care, of making a difference in the world. A version that could take broken things and help them heal. A version that understood that sometimes the most profound purpose comes from the simplest acts of kindness. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Hope came over and laid her head on my lap, looking up at me with eyes that held all the trust and love in the world. Courage and faith settled on either side of me, creating a circle of warmth and contentment that felt like the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, surrounded by the beings who had taught me what unconditional love really meant, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before the war. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of knowing that whatever problems came, we would face them together. The homeless veteran who had found 3 puppies in a cardboard box had become something he'd never imagined possible. A man with a home, a purpose, and a family that would never abandon him, no matter what storms might come. And in saving 3 small lives on a rainy night, I had discovered the most important truth of all. Sometimes when you think you're rescuing someone else, you're actually rescuing yourself. The rain still falls sometimes, washing the city clean, reminding me of that night when everything changed. But now when I hear it, I don't hear despair. I hear possibility. I hear hope. I hear the sound of love finding its way to where it's needed most, even in the darkest places, even when all seems lost. Because love always finds a way. And sometimes it comes in a cardboard box, soaked by rain, carried by 3 small hearts that refuse to give up. Sometimes it comes exactly when you need it most,